going to talk somewhat about some population interactions. For example, predator-prey dynamics. Okay, when we look at our population growth curves, I showed you that one, the logistic growth with the population fluctuating around what we call the carrying capacity. And when we look at some controls that exist in ecosystems, we see these predator-prey dynamics in those populations mimicking each other in a lot of ways. For example, when we think about predation on animals, well, clearly that keeps population under control. That's going to be something that limits the population, or a limiting factor. For example, when we think about moose and wolves, wolves eat moose. So if a wolf population goes up, well, guess what? It's going to eat more moose. And then that moose population is going to decline. As it declines, there might be wolves, they're going to be competing for food, and that wolf population could come down. As it comes down, the moose population will rebound and increase, and there might be more wolves. So we'll see them fluctuating together. Okay, obviously there's going to be overall more moose than wolves because they are farther down in the pyramid, but their populations are going to fluctuate together because their populations are somewhat dependent. And the same would go for as we talk about producers, etc. Okay, we also want to talk about parasites. Remember, parasites are dependent on a host. So if there are no hosts, there may be no parasites. So parasites like tapeworms, bacteria, protozoans, virus, fungus, different types of organisms, etc. that exist that are, again, dependent on a host. So they're going to fluctuate, those kind of predator-prey or parasite-host dynamic, where it's going to fluctuate together. If the parasite keeps killing the host, well, guess what? Those numbers are going to decline. So, again, fluctuating populations together. And the same, plant herbivore. So herbivores are primary consumers. They are going to eat plants. So as plant populations increase, well, guess what? Herbivores can increase. But as herbivores eat more plants, guess what? The plants might decrease, and then the herbivores will decrease. So just like the moose and wolves, we could have, our plant and our primary consumer dynamic, where those populations will fluctuate together as well. Finally, here on this screen, I want to talk about mutualists. Two or more species that benefit from interaction. All right, this is a big deal. They interact with each other. They benefit each other in different ways. For example, there's fungus in plant roots. The fungus helps plants absorb nutrients at their roots, and the plant roots protect the fungus and provide energy to them. We have microbes or bacteria in our gut. They live in our gut. They're happy to be there. They have all this food coming at them, and they do some digestion for us. So that's a mutualistic relationship. And there are a lot of those in nature. And again, those populations are going to, work together. They are going to exist together. If, the plant roots can protect the fungus, there'd be more fungus. They can grow and be safe. Okay, as there's more fungus, they can help plants absorb more nutrients and grow. Okay, if there's less, then they'll fluctuate together up and down. All right, so many different types of dynamics that are occurring, many different types of population interactions. In this slide, I just wanted to show you an example of predation on animals that can control population. Again, part of that limiting factor can be predation. And you have the lynx in the hare. The lynx obviously has a smaller population because it is going to be a secondary consumer. The hare will be a primary consumer. And therefore you'll see that maroon curve at the bottom. The lynx is going to have certainly a smaller number of lynx, or a smaller population. The hare will have a larger population overall. But what you'll notice is that, for example, as the hare population increases, well, the lynx population will increase because it will have more food. But then if the lynx overeats the hare, then the hare population will go down and the lynx population will go down. So we'll see this relationship fluctuate together, one reacting to the other one. So you see the hare population increase, and then you see the lynx population increase, and vice versa, up and down, up and down, up and down. And basically that happens. You could look at the same situation where a hare would eat some kind of vegetation, and you'd see that same type of fluctuation where you would have more vegetation than hare, but they would fluctuate together. Okay, that again, predation controls population, and again, the predator-prey dynamic really shows under normal circumstances the way that the food web or the ecosystem is built, so that all those populations from the producers through the consumer levels are all controlled by each other, okay, in their numbers. And when something is not, something is out of whack, like there's an invasive species that has no, known predator, okay, that population can just spike up, and it doesn't have that normal control in a natural system. Another important interaction that occurs in nature is obviously competition, and we have different types of competition. We have what's called interspecific competition, and we have intraspecific competition. So let's focus in on interspecific competition first, and that's among different species. So for example, here we have competition between different types of plant species. All right, plants need light and CO2 and water. So if there are different plant species in a forest, well, the more successful ones are probably going to be the ones that can grow the tallest and spread out and get their leaves absorbing a lot of light energy, or have roots that can get deep enough to get water. So they're going to be competing for the same resources, but they're different species. So maybe one species will be outcompeted for some kind of resource, and it might be eliminated. All right, we call that elimination competitive exclusion. So if two species compete for some scarce resource, one may be eliminated. Okay, one species might be better than another at surviving. Okay, we think about natural selection. Okay, between different species, one might be competitively excluded. Okay, and that can go for not only plants, but certainly different species of animals. Okay, if squirrels and chipmunks are competing for the same food resource, and one is better at getting it, well, guess what? The other one may be excluded. All right, we like this competition in ecosystems. When we're talking about herbivory, or the plant matter, this competition often results in what we call a balanced herbivory. Okay, a diversified plant community maintained by herbivores. They're going to eat different things, they're going to compete for different things, and it's going to lead to hopefully a nice balance of different types of plant matter. Okay, a diversified plant community. Okay, like I said, there's also what we call intraspecific competition, or sometimes we call this territoriality among members of the same species. Okay, intraspecific, among members of the same species. And this also controls a population. All right, whether they're fighting for, competing for some kind of food resource, they're competing for water, they're competing for a mate. Okay, territoriality. All right, we think about, even in our lives, our dogs are, they are territorial. Our pets, our cats, when another cat approaches, they get very territorial. They're protecting what they think is theirs. Okay, and this controls populations. It's a type of competition. Humans, we are territorial. Okay, if we feel like someone's in our personal space, okay, on our private property, we get territorial. We also get territorial of our mates. Okay, we say, that's my mate. You can't come approach my mate. We see this in other animal species that they say, same thing. They protect what they think is theirs. And we do some really interesting things to protect what we think is ours. So that is competition, a couple different types. And again, all of these things really do control populations and keep them from getting really growing exponentially. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about introduced and invasive species, and this is a really big deal. And I ask you to read about it in your chapter this week. Species can be introduced into different ecosystems by accident or intentionally. Okay, we often plant invasive species of plants in our yards, so we're moving them to an environment they don't typically live in. We've taken some species and intentionally put them, some animal species, and put them in places that they don't belong. In Australia, they introduced the cane toads to control a cane sugar pest to eat it, and because these cane toads were poisonous, no organism would eat them. So yeah, they took care of the pest problem there, but now they're their own pest because there's millions of them in Australia, just growing pretty exponentially because they have no natural predator. So that is a case where there's just way too many. They never belong there in the first place, and we introduce them on purpose to control a pest. So we have to be really careful what we do. Sometimes we do it by accident. We think about bed bugs. We travel, they get in our luggage, we transport them. We think about zebra mussels on boats, certainly a problem here in the Great Lakes, where zebra mussels adhere to boats, and you hear about don't hitchhike zebra mussels. We don't want those getting into Great Lakes where they don't belong. They can cause all kinds of clogging of discharge pipes, and it's a big issue. The Asian carp migration, species that have just moved into different places where they don't belong. Here I know we have not only a certain type of ladybug that isn't native that has been able to grow exponentially here, and the stink bug population. You've probably seen a certain type of stink bug that is, every once in a while you'll see their population just grow like crazy because again, they might not have a natural predator, they might have unlimited food. So it is a big deal, and we have to be really careful about what we do. The Asian carp in the Great Lakes, we're trying to prevent the spread of it because the Asian carp eats everything. It eats everything and it has no predator. So that's a really big concern. And you might say, well, it might be represented by a J curve, but it'll crash, right? And, well, yeah, it will crash eventually, but at what cost? Will it have eaten every single fish in the Great Lakes and then crash? So it's an issue that really needs to be controlled, and there's a lot of people involved in trying to do that. So there's a lot of things that can happen when a species is introduced. It can take over by killing other species. It can eat all the resources and then die out. Okay, if it has no natural enemies, the population can grow out of control. Or you could introduce it and it just can't survive at all. So if we took, for example, a saltwater fish, and we decided we wanted to bring it, here to the Great Lakes, and we put it in. Well, it's not going to become invasive because it can't possibly live in fresh water. We know that. So there's species that might accidentally jump on board your plane, but when they get here to Michigan, they can't survive because of the climate, etc. So sometimes it becomes a problem, and those are the ones that we know of. The ones that are transported maybe accidentally and don't survive, we don't even know about because they don't become invasive. In this slide, you can see from your textbook an image of some of the impacts that the zebra mussels have had on the Great Lakes community. Some of the clogging of the intake pipes of the power plants that have to be certainly cleaned out, that it's an economic loss for us. We see decreases in the plankton population, both phyto and zooplankton. And again, that can cause issues with other populations. We know that when some populations fluctuate, other populations fluctuate along with them. And we see different kinds of impacts from that. And you can see there at the top that from the NWF, the National Wildlife Federation, Andy Bushbaum says, we are seeing changes in the Great Lakes that are more rapid and more destructive than at any time in their history, between the zebra mussels and certainly the Asian carp are a really huge concern. And that is millions of dollars that we are putting together as Great Lakes community members to battle the Asian carp and keep it from spreading throughout the Great Lakes. There's all different types of things that are going on, barriers being built to trying to figure out how to catch them and prevent the spread of them. It's a very expensive proposition, but really felt that we need to do it in order to protect the health of the Great Lakes, not only the water quality, but certainly the organisms that live there. Okay, our last topic today is disturbance and succession. I want to talk a little bit about what we call ecological succession, and that is really the change of one biotic community into another. And we've seen a lot of succession over the history of our planet where, for example, a pond ecosystem has become a prairie ecosystem, has become a forest ecosystem, has become another aquatic environment. And as the climate on Earth changes in different places, succession occurs, and the environment changes there, and therefore the organisms that live there change as well. Okay, so when we talk about ecological succession, we're talking about that change is the big word there, of one biotic community into another. Okay, we often see ecosystems that become what we call climax ecosystems. Over time, they become these, I don't want to say a perfect ecosystem, but an ecosystem in which there's this dynamic balance between all the species and the physical environment. We think of a climax forest ecosystem as like an old growth forest where there's this really good balance between all the species that live there, a really healthy ecosystem, this dynamic balance. Within that ecosystem, we can identify what we call keystone species. Now, I said earlier in earlier lectures that all species have value. All right, they're there for a reason. They're somebody's food. They eat somebody. They help clean up the environment. They do something. So they all have value, but sometimes we can identify what we call a keystone species. And that's a species that has a greater influence than others and is essential in their food web. All right, in a really elaborate food web, a species may be eliminated and that ecosystem will not decline. But the concern is that with keystone species, if for some reason something happens to that species, the concern is that that system will collapse. It's that important. Typically, we think of these as our higher level consumers. When we talk about primary succession, there's different types of succession. One of them is primary succession. And that's kind of that initial invasion. Think about primary as initial. Initial invasion and then the progression from one biotic community to the next. All right, if there, if a system changes, if it becomes flooded and, with water, just over time, okay, if it becomes an area that receives more precipitation over time, well, it's going to slowly turn into some kind of aquatic environment, and the species that live there are going to be different than before. Those initial species that kind of end up there are what we call pioneer species, the species that arrive first. Those could be things like fungus and algae, lichens, that can live on certain substrates that, are very barren or on rocks. Okay, these pioneer species that kind of start things up. And those species may not be the ones that are there when it becomes a climax ecosystem. They might not be there along the way. They're the initial invaders. and then once things get going and other species come in, they may become outcompeted.
This is an image from your book showing the difference between primary succession and secondary succession. In primary succession, you can see where you're really starting from a bare substrate, like the bare rock, with nothing at all, no life at all there. And you can see the pioneer stages of primary succession, things like lichens that can live in a really, parched environment. The grasses, small herbs, and forbs starting to come in. And again, this takes a long period of time. The shrubs and fast-growing trees coming, and then starting to see other species coming and going along that period of different changes because of succession, and eventually getting to what we call a climax community over many, 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 many years, where you have all different types of species that can tolerate, for example, in this forest community, they can tolerate a lot of shade, and then you have trees that can grow taller within the canopy that need a lot of light to grow that tall. So again, that balanced herbivory, that balanced ecosystem there after many, 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 many years. Okay, now that's contrasted with the secondary succession, which is below, that we'll talk more about on the next slide, where some kind of disturbance has happened to the land, and again, there is a pioneer stage, but there is usually, when we have some kind of disturbance, like agriculture, you'll see there a storm, landslide, a forest fire, there's still going to be some substrate, there's going to be some, for example, nutrient-rich soil, that can, certainly grow plants and such. It's not a bare substrate. There's a lot of, for example, after a forest fire, there's a lot of nutrients in that soil, organic matter, etc., that can kind of stimulate growth much more easily, generally, than in primary succession, where you're starting with a bare, stripped, completely stripped substrate.
Okay, secondary succession occurs after a disturbance. It's the reinvasion of an area in a series of stages after some kind of big change, some kind of disturbance, after a forest fire, after an extreme flood, after some kind of hurricane. Some kind of disturbance has swept through and kind of wiped out the area. Now, that doesn't mean that that area has no value and there's no nutrients, etc. Often it's the opposite. It is a really nutrient area, nutritious area for organisms, and it can easily be reinvaded. But it takes time, and it happens in a series of stages. There's a lot of organic matter, some biota might still exist there. So it's just that kind of succession, that rebuilding, that change that happens after some kind of big event. Finally, we'll talk about aquatic succession. That's when we have some kind of aquatic environment that fills in, for example, a lake or a pond and becomes some kind of terrestrial environment. Okay, and we see this over time. We can do soil cores into the earth underground, and we can pull up soil layers that can tell us what type of environment has been there over time. Okay, my final slide here is really dedicated to talking about that ecosystem disturbance and how resilient ecosystems are, healthy ecosystems, to these changes. We often see them rebound, and my example that I'm going to use today is fire in succession. And in your homework assignment this week, I ask you to kind of look into some fire ecology and how fire management has changed over time. Fires in a forest ecosystem, for example, are absolutely natural and important. They maintain the balance among species. They provide an opportunity for renewal, giving other species a chance to survive there. Forest fires release a lot of nutrients back into the soil, and it helps some plants reproduce. There are plants that are specifically adapted to fire, whether it's their bark is resilient to it, or their reproductive strategy is to only reproduce under a high heat situation. So you'll read a little bit about the cones, those serotinous cones that exist that allow these plants to reproduce. It's quite fascinating. When we think about fire ecology and fire, prevention and management, things have absolutely changed. When we think about, the forest fires that are happening in the West, it's so dry out there and they happen. We often see the planes flying over and extinguishing them. And a lot of forest fires we do extinguish, and the reason is because we're concerned about our safety, we're concerned about our things, our homes, etc., with good reason, and so we do extinguish them. But a lot of fires we allow to burn because it is a natural cycle for the forest, as long as it's not going to negatively impact us. We also do prescribed burns where we actually light small fires, and the reasoning behind this is because we want to burn that leaf litter that's on the forest floor. What happens is if that matter builds up and there's a fire that is ignited there, often it can result in what we call a crown fire, where the fire goes up into the tree canopy, and that can absolutely decimate a forest ecosystem. So sometimes forest management, part of that is just, really burning up some of that leaf litter, that fuel that exists on the forest floor, so that we don't have a massive fire at a later time. Okay, when we talk about resilient ecosystems, again, biodiversity is really key for that. Resilient ecosystems are healthy. They have a huge diversity of organisms that are there. We want to see a really elaborate food web. We want to see this nice climax ecosystem. These systems are typically the ones that can deal with some kind of impact. Okay, the biodiversity. When we think about something called a monoculture, where there's, for example, one species, it makes things really vulnerable to some kind of disturbance. Okay, we don't want to see just one species. If something happens to that one species, the whole thing's going to be wiped out. We want to see multiple organisms, multiple species living there, so that it is more stable. When we look at a very simplified system, it can be very unstable and very vulnerable, like I said. So we want to see this really elaborate system. Later in the semester, you'll read about the Gulf disaster, okay, the Gulf oil spill disaster, the Deepwater Horizon explosion and resulting spewing of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And it's a very resilient ecosystem there, and scientists are very positive about its recovery. It's going to take a really long time for it to recover, and it may not fully recover, but it is a really diverse, relatively healthy ecosystem under normal circumstances. And the location of it and the climate down there, the idea is that it is going to rebound significantly from that disaster. So time will tell. It's been about 5 years at this point when I'm recording this lecture. But, we will see. Time will tell. But the idea is that if we're starting with very healthy ecosystems, if we have some kind of negative impact, the hope is that they will be able to bounce back.